Our exhortation this morning will be given to us by Brother Roger Anderson. His subject will be Tears in a Bottle, and he's asked that we read Psalm 56, verse 8. Psalm 56, verse 8. Thou tellest my wanderings, put thou my tears into thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? So we'll now turn our attention to Brother Roger, the subject, Tears in a Bottle.
Good morning, everyone. Before I get started, I thought about it a little bit, and it's been 9.5 years since I stood up here. And I just want to say it's so good to be back and to be with you. Anybody got a tear bottle? I thought I did. It's on. All right. But anyway, it's emotional to be back and stand in front of you again. I even remember the day very well. It was Super Bowl Sunday, 2010. And I wasn't even here because we had a major snowstorm, about 16 inches. And I gave my last exhortation in Walter's living room. Walter might remember that to you. So I wasn't even here when I gave it, but it's just good to be back and to be in front of you again. And I speak for Leah also. So anyway, Tears in a Bottle. I've watched people's faces as they walk in and they see the slide, and I'm sure there's a curiosity of what this might be, what it might be about. And I found it a very interesting study. I don't even remember how I fell into it, but a tear bottle is only mentioned. In fact, most people don't even know it's mentioned in the Bible. And it's only mentioned once. And I was able to build this exhortation around it, and we'll have a little fun with it, and it'll take us on the emotional journeys that many of us go on. So let's go ahead and see where this goes. In Psalms it says, as was read, "Thou tellest my wanderings, put thou my tears into a bottle. Are they not in thy book?" We have two places here that David wanted his sufferings recorded. And he says, are they not in thy book? He already knew that God had recorded them in his mind. And David is asking God in a very poetic manner to always remember his sufferings and to store up his personal tears in his own heavenly bottle of tears. And we're going to look at the history of this first. Then we're going to look at the science of tears, and then we're going to look at how God uses it. But anyway, it's a very beautiful verse. It's kind of all by itself, and you'll see where it goes. It's very, very lovely. But David wanted his tears to be remembered also, not just the suffering, but the tears also. And that's the beauty of this. But let's go ahead and look at a little background. This is where I had to go online, and you could get all this information yourself about tear bottles. It was an ancient custom during the time of heartache and grief to hold tear bottles beneath their eyes to catch their tears of grief. This is something that goes way back, even before Christ's day, because here David mentions them. At death, in some cultures, these bottles were actually buried with the owners as valuable possessions, I guess, to take with them to the next world, as whatever they believe. So it's just interesting history about this. Ancient tear bottles, or wineskins, as some have been found, have actually been excavated by archaeologists in Israel. Keeping in mind who's saying this verse. So this was something that was real, and that they have found proof of it. It's not just some pretty sentence. It was something that people did. So let's take a little walk through antiquity. It's difficult to say exactly when the first tear bottles came into being, but David lived approximately 1040 to 970 BC. And he wrote Psalms 56. It's thought to be about 1020 BC. So we're 1,000 years before Christ. Tear bottles at that time might have been made of pottery, sardic stone, wine skins or animal skins, and were also which were common vessels for carrying fluids. These are what thought to be tear bottles when you do research on it that they found, and you can see the shape of it. But let's come up through history a little bit. The Roman time period. The Roman period saw the invention of glass blowing around 100 AD. This new technology allowed thousands of glass bottles to be produced and made bottles more accessible for medicine and perfumes. The teardrop shape was easily produced and quickly became a common style. So as they came up, the archaeologists came up more through history, they found more and more of these small, almost medicine-type bottles. To come up something a little closer to our time, the Civil War period. I thought this was interesting because I never knew this, but stories of soldiers leaving their wives or new brides with a tear bottle can be found in literature of the day. Some husbands are said to have hoped that the bottles would be full upon their return, and as an indication of their wives' devotion. But as sadly as we know, many of these men never came home, and I'm sure that the tear bottles were probably kept up for a long time, or perhaps even buried with some of them. So interesting history. It's not a real spiritual lesson there, but there's something to be considered in how the world viewed tears. Now let's come into modern times. It's a powerful symbolism behind the tear bottle continues to provide today's writers, musicians, artists with content in their poetry song and painting, and even movies. And for those of you who are familiar with the Harry Potter series, one of the climatic scenes in that was the tear bottles of the character Snape being collected so that they could find out how everything unfolded. It was sort of like a climactic part of that movie, which was a major movie. So it shows that that concept is still being used. Interesting stuff, but there's more for us to look at. So here's where we can kind of start thinking. You don't think about the how many faces tears come in. It can be comical at times, and other times it can be very serious. And for many reasons that we shed tears. And I'm going to go through some of the science with it, and it's very interesting of the science because there's some things that are understood, and then there's things that scientists still don't understand today. So real quickly, here's something we all have seen, we've all probably done. And you kind of think, what kind of tears would these be? I see parents pointing to their kids to look up here. What kind of tear? I thought, well, these look like nap time tears to me. You know, we all know, time for a nap, put them down. We're done. So, and then here's another one. What kind of tears might these be? As I thought about it, and I think about you ladies, these could be maybe bad hair day tears. You know, I know you ladies always have those kind of days. You just can't get it to work. But anyway, well, but let's on a more serious note, let's look at some other faces. There's ones like these. I consider these like stressful day tears. Those tears where the job gets to you, some things are over, whatever your problems are, and at the end of the day, there's a tear shed. You may not weep and cry, but there's a tear there sometimes. We've all been through those tears. There's also the tears like perhaps this young lady. I don't know why she's crying, but what came to my mind was broken heart tears. She could be, in my mind, I could see her watching the love of her life walk away. You know, and they're all different tears with different emotions attached to them, but they come, whether they're funny or not. And then the ones we see every day in the news, these are the tears of poverty and oppression. And we can just feel our moods change as with each face. We can feel the mood change and the sympathy we might feel. And then finally, ones that we will all experience at some point is the tears of grief and loss. It's inevitable. We are going to experience those kind of things. But anyway, that's just in getting started. Those are, you could feel the different emotions attached to each face. And they're all out there and they're real. Now, do they have a spiritual significance? In some cases, no, but there are cases where, well, I hope to show you where it made a difference. So, here's another little pouty one. Is not getting its way too well, but we're moving on from that. This is a little science about tears. We're going to get into the science and understand why they work and all. And you may already know this, but there's some interesting things to be said about it as we build up to where we're going. What causes tears? You might say, well, I know the ducts in my eyes, but why do we cry when we're sad? Think about that. Why do we cry when we're sad? And there's a mechanism that's not understood that we're going to look at. But first, let's just, what we know from science class so much, that we have a tear duct system in all of our eyes. And I didn't realize this. This is where I was learning that the eye is actually lubricated from 3 different points on the eye. I thought it was just from the corner of the eye, but it's actually the whole, all the way around the eye is lubricated. But we all understand that. And then looking into it a little farther, there are basically 3 types of tears scientifically that are generated. And that's where we're going to build up a little bit here. And the first ones for you guys and girls out there who know science, I had to learn this by studying it to put this together, but they're called basal tears. I never knew that. And basal tears, they lubricate the eye to keep it clear of dust. All of us here have right now basal tears in their eyes. They're working all day long. They never stop. And if they did, we would go blind because our eyes would dry out. And so this is a normal thing, but they're tears. They are tears. That's what they're called. It's just not overflowing down your cheeks. Then there are what's called reflex tears. We've all done this where we're cutting an onion, and sometimes the tears just start flowing. And this comes from, these type of tears are a result of irritation of the eye by foreign particles or from the presence of irritants such as onion vapors, tear gas, and pepper spray. Of course, we've all experienced that, right? Maybe if you lived in the 60s, and you might have, but anyway, the onions, we've cut onions to where you have to walk away from the onion. It is so powerful that you can't even finish cutting it sometimes because the tears, you can't see. The tears are just flowing down your face. But this is from an external source irritating the eye. It's an external, or that's why they're called reflex tears, because we respond to an outside source. Then we have what's called psychic tears or crying and weeping tears. Like this little boy, looks like he just got the scolding of his life. No telling what he did, but he's crying because he's hurting where? Not from onions or something like that, but from inside. It is caused by what's called increased lacrimation or tearing due to strong emotional stress, anger, suffering, mourning, physical pain, or joy. We all know we cry sometimes when we're so happy, the tears flow. Okay, so there's a lot of science. It might be neat stuff, might be boring to a lot of you. But when we see where we're going, it's interesting to know on the front end. Because here's why. Here's where it kind of gets maybe a little more interesting. The first 2 are common, and we know why they're caused. The emotional ones, there's only theories to why they're caused. You can look this up. And I got about 3 of them. There might be more. One is to release stress. Research has been done done on emotional tears in the past suggests that when a person cries, tears carry with them all the stressful chemicals of the body. That's a theory. It's not a fact. It's just a theory. Another one is when a person cries, it's a way of showing that he is weak and vulnerable. By crying in front of his adversaries, a person tries to gain their sympathy. I think of something like crocodile tears. They can force them, but they're not sincere, perhaps. Again, a theory. And one other is that crying is a way to communicate with others that you are in need or hurting. But again, a theory, because when I'm hurting and I start crying, I didn't say I better turn on the crying switch. and the tears start flowing. They just come. I don't have any control over it. And everybody's different at the different tolerances of what they'll cry at, and it's different for everybody. Here's the facts about the theories. The truth is, there is no definite understanding as to why the brain activates tears during emotional situations, as the eyes are not in need of cleansing or lubricating. You don't have anything trying to get in them. They're clean. They're working just fine. Scientists know how it works, but they don't know why it works. Isn't that interesting? I never thought about that. I thought, well, yeah, you cry when you get hurt or your mom spanks you. But why? Why? Can't they find the source of the mechanism that makes it work? It exists. God created us. And that's where we'll kind of be going from here, looking at this possible mechanism that is only theories to other people. So here's what we need to look at. How are tears talked about in the scriptures? This is where it turns into a spiritual lesson, not just a mechanical lesson. And what can we learn about how God views them? And this was a real interesting and enjoyable thing for me to learn, to see how these little nuggets of treasure are embedded in some of the stories that we're going to look at. The Bible, as we know, is an emotional book. I got a little emotional just saying hello to you, just because. Why? Because of the Bible. It's what brought us all here. It affects us in so many ways. And it speaks to us on many levels, doesn't it? How many times have we all been doing our readings, and we'll read about the kingdom or a hope, the resurrection, and tears come into our eyes. Or we read about the suffering of Christ, and tears come into our eyes. Or we just, it's about our hope, our sadness, our joy. And every single one of us here at some point has shed a tear because he read the scripture. I just know that to be true. So it affects us. It activates that mechanism that God has put in us. His word does. So let's look at how tears are talked about in the scriptures, and this is the real lesson that comes out of it. The boy with the dumb spirit. We all know the story very well. Jesus was on his way down, I believe, from the Mount of Transfiguration. In the meantime, the apostles were trying to heal the epileptic boy, and they couldn't. They couldn't heal him. And it was very frustrating to the father who was at his end. But let's look at the story for a minute and get into the emotion of this moment. It says, and he, that's Jesus, asked his father, how long ago since this came unto him? And he said, of a child. So he must have been grown. When we say a boy, he could have been, a young man in his 20s, but of a child. So it's been a long time. And consider life with a child of this condition that we know now today to be epilepsy. We have a lot of safety things in place today that they didn't back then. Fires, open fires were a normal thing. Campfires, heating fires. Today we don't have fires in our home. We don't have fires that we're warming ourselves by except in a controlled fireplace. So at any time, an epileptic seizure could cause a boy to collapse into a fire or into a lake, or if he was in a rowboat or something. At any time, he's suddenly in peril. And of course, when you don't even understand what's physically wrong with him, like today, we know he has seizures, we can make allowances to keep him in safety. But they didn't have that option back then. But anyway, just consider a life where this man had been for 20 plus years probably. It says, oftentimes it has cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Now it's interesting. He said, if you can do anything. It's very interesting. The very next phrase comes from Jesus, and look what he said. He said, Jesus said to him, if you can believe. He put the question right back. Yeah, I can do something. If you can do something. If you can believe, I can do this. I think it's a real interesting thing, the way that went back and forth there. Of course, keep in mind now that he has come to the apostles thinking it's probably his last chance to heal him. If the apostles can't heal him, nobody can. And they failed. Luckily, the Son of God walks up. How often does that happen? You know, what an opportunity that he has fallen into. Of course, he's already at his end. He says, and straightway the father of the child cried out and said, what did he, look what was recorded, with tears. That's not mentioned before. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Now I ask you for a moment, if you took that little phrase out of there, with tears, the whole emotion could be anything. He could have said, yeah, help my unbelief. You know, Lord, this ain't working. These guys can't do it. Yeah, I believe, but I have trouble. That's not it. It recorded it with tears because it's important that you understand that he had come to the point that seemed impossible. Could never have been handled. So immediately the motions are put into it with that little phrase, with tears. Now, then it goes through the process of raising the boy up. It says, when Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. And the spirit cried and rent him sore, and came out of him, and he was as one dead. That many said, he is dead. So he must have just looked like he had stopped breathing, just said that expired, like whatever happened overpowered him and just stopped his heart. He was as good as dead in people's mind. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. Now, I never saw this all my life until just a few years ago. There's a shadow of the resurrection here, because he appeared to be dead and he arose. And what did he arise to? A new life, a totally new life. Everything from that point on would change. And you can see that shadow of the resurrection, which doesn't really have anything to do with the tears so much, but it's a beautiful story that's unfolding here. So, what is the power of this story here? What is the real power behind what is happening here? One, and this is probably the most important thing that we have to accept, sometimes God takes us to the edge of despair. Many times we pray, why, Lord? Why are you doing this? Because you're not to the edge of despair yet. This man had run out of options. There were no doctors. There were no apostles that could even heal him. He was taken to the edge of despair. And why? To bring out the inward man that was deep inside. That inward man. Not the man on the outside who maybe can control himself, say, yeah, I hope you can heal him, do the best you can. If not, well, that's just the way it is. We have to live it. He was pushed to where he felt hopeless. He said, to lay it before him because you have nowhere else to turn. That is the power of this story. He had nowhere else to turn but to Jesus, because even the apostles had failed. That's pretty powerful. He's saying, here is my heart, Lord. Help my unbelief. Very powerful. And the scriptures speak of the inward man. I suggest to you that this is what the tears will show in our lives and in the scriptures. Look what it says in 2 Corinthians. We having the same spirit of faith, according as it is written, I, Paul, who is speaking, believe, and therefore have I spoken. We also believe and therefore speak. Knowing this, that he which raised us up the Lord Jesus, shall raise us up also by Jesus, and shall present us with you. Remember the boy who appeared to almost be resurrected from the dead in the presence of people? For all things are for your sakes, that the abundant grace might through thanksgiving be made many redound to the glory of God. Abundant grace cannot be fully appreciated until we have been taken to despair. We can never, if we were just healed right at birth, would you ever understand God's grace? But think of the blind man and the lame man who lived most of their life crippled or blind. They understood abundant grace in a way we might not ever. And this man who has a 20-year-old who no telling how many times came to the brink of death. The verses go on. For which cause we faint not, But though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. Renewed. How is that renewed? It's that mechanism of understanding God's grace. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. The father of this boy had confessed his struggle, had to confess that he was struggling. He was put in that point, he had nothing else to do but to confess. I have nowhere else to turn but to you, Lord. And if you can do anything. And all he said was, if you believe, then it can be so. And sometimes we have to be taken to an extreme to confess certain things about ourselves. So when these things come upon us, no matter how bad they are, realize that you're on a journey. You're not floundering. King Hezekiah, I think we talked about this down in Sunday school for a moment. For those, if I don't know if you can recognize the picture so much, but Isaiah is standing there with King Hezekiah on his deathbed, and there's a sundial right next to him. And if you remember the story, the sundial got turned back as proof that God would do what he said. But we won't look at that part so much as the story of Hezekiah's heart. In 2 Kings, it says, in those days was Hezekiah sick unto death. And the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, came to him and said unto him, thus saith the Lord, set thine house in order, for you shall die and not live. That's pretty harsh. Imagine a prophet walking into your house and said, get your house in order, you're going to die. It seems almost incompassionate in a way, but of course he had a relationship with Isaiah, and maybe there had been other discussion, but it seems a little harsh. Well, as the story goes, Hezekiah, he turned his face to the wall and prayed unto the Lord. Imagine you turning your face to the wall. You can see this, this is going to happen. And you become to the reality, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. And you make one last plea to the Lord. As it goes on, here's what he said in his prayer, I beseech thee, O Lord, remember now, I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And Hezekiah wept sore. That is so important that is in there, because it's actually the hinge point of the whole story. And I never really realized it, because look what it says. And it came to pass before Isaiah had gone out of the middle of the court, he hadn't even gotten off the grounds, yet, that the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, turn again and tell Hezekiah, the captain of my people, thus saith the Lord God of David, thy father, I have heard thy prayer, I have seen thy tears. Think about the power of that. Behold, I will heal thee. On the third day, thou shalt go unto the house of the Lord. I have seen thy tears. What does that imply? Think about it for a minute. What does that imply? He didn't say, you didn't go through all the things he listed that you did good. Oh, you did this, you did this, you did this. You kept my laws. He said, I've seen your tears. Think about the inward man coming out. What it says to me, in this situation, your tears make a difference to God. Whether he changes the situation or not, your tears make a difference. It's very clear. That's what God responded to. They can be the deciding factor in the direction that God takes in the next step with you. Not that, now if you're forced like crocodile tears, well, I'll just cry some tears and the Lord will answer my prayer. No, he knew his heart was pouring out before him. Sometimes we may feel very alone in our sorrow, and I think about him staring at that block wall and that prayer. That moment where I'm going to die, and I can't stop. It shows that our tears do not go unnoticed. They're not just part of the physical makeup that happens when we are hurting. Our tears are part of the journey. And that is so critical, because it says so much. It's the highlight of that story. Let's look at another one. The woman at Jesus' feet. We again, one that's a very emotional story in Luke. It says, and behold, a woman in the city which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with oil. Now, I didn't realize how much is in here. This one verse is jam-packed with humility. Look, she actually did 5 humble acts in that little bit I just read. She stood behind him. She wiped his feet with the hairs of her head. She kissed his feet. She anointed them. She washed the feet with her tears. And this was that inward man or woman, in this case, coming out. All the other gestures were good and very humble, but the tears are what told the story of everything she did. And this is something in studying certain numbers. 5 is the number of grace in Scripture. If you didn't know that, 5 is the number of grace. I don't know. Maybe there's something there, maybe not. But I think that is absolutely beautiful of what's taking place here. Well, Jesus continued with this woman. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, do you see this woman? I entered into thine house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil you did not anoint, but this woman has anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. To Jesus, the tears communicated the sincerity of the other 4 acts that she did. That sincerity became so true, where she could have done these things to gain his favor, but the tears told the story of what was inside. So, there's 3 very interesting stories that tears are like the central thought of everything that's happened. Well, we have one more that we know so well. As we know, he knew better than anyone about sorrow so much, and it's very fitting as we come around the table of our Lord to consider these things. Look what Matthew says, and we know these verses so well. And he took with him Peter and 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be sorrowful and very heavy. And he said unto them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here, and watch with me. And he went a little further, and fell on his face, and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. We know the story so well. And it almost breaks your heart every time we read it and think about it. He knows and understands. He needed to know and understand our feelings to be able to judge us appropriately. But there's no tears mentioned here in the gospel. You have to go to another place to find that. And that's in the book of Hebrews. The writer of the Hebrews recorded that moment. And I think that's what a treasure to have had that recorded. Because he said in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with what? Strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared. Very powerful. Though he were a son, yet learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all of them that obey him. So, what do we learn from our Lord's example of tears being shed? This is very interesting and very powerful. And it may have to be applied to us. This time, the tears did not change God's decision. Even with his own son, they did not change his decision. But we know that he sent him a comforter. It's recorded that an angel came and comforted him. In other words, you've got to go through it. You've got to take it to the end, but I'll be there and give you the comfort you need to survive it. That is the powerful lesson in here. And for us, there will be times that we have to learn obedience by the things we suffer, and you're going to have to go the distance. It might be with cancer. It could be with a severe loss. We just don't know. It could be anything. It could be different for everyone. If Jesus, the Son of God, had to, should we not also? It may be required of us, and it's been required of many of the saints through the ages, as we're going to look at here shortly. Some of them had to go the distance, just as Jesus went the distance. But he had the sins of the world on his shoulders. They did not. Brothers and sisters, what we've seen, this world is filled of despair and anguish, and grief is everywhere. We can't watch the news without seeing someone crying now, or being abused, or the children being killed in the schools. It's just horrible what's happening. And in every newscast, if you watch the news through, you will see a tear shed somehow. It's just become such a big part of our daily life, is that the world is crying and groaning and travailing in terrible pain. So what is the solution? Many of us know this. Look, the new faces of the future. Look what Isaiah says. And in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wine on lees, of fat things full of marrow, of wine on the lees, well refined. It says, and he will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, the darkness that is over all the faces of mankind who do not know him. He's going to remove that. And the veil that is spread over the nations. But look what he said, the very next verse. And the Lord will wipe away all tears from off their faces and rebuke his people, and the rebuke of his people shall not take away from off the earth, for the Lord has spoken it. He's not just going to wipe away the tears of our tears, but eventually the whole planet, the tears will be wiped away. It's an enormous task that lays before us all to help Christ do that when this day comes as his saints, when we're given our commission. But let's go back in time just a little bit, actually quite a bit. In the fifth seal, look at what the brethren had to deal with. It's about the souls under the altar. If you don't know Revelations well, but it's a vision of things that were in the past, and then we'll look at the same people in the future. In Revelation 6, and when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw on the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God. Think of all the families that wept and cried, and the tears that were shed during those dark, very dark days of the early churches. And for the testimony which they held, and they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge the blood of them that dwell on the earth? And the white robes were given unto every one of them. And it was said unto them that they should rest yet for a little season until their fellow servants also and their brethren that should be killed. There was more coming. In that time in history, already saying there's more coming yet. It's not over, but just rest. That till it should be fulfilled. And then when we jump in, John then sees a vision of these white robe multitude in the kingdom age. He says, and one of the elders answered and said unto me, Who are these that are arrayed in white robes, and whence came they? And he said unto him, Sir, you know. And he said unto me, He said, These are they that came out of great tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So we can see that cleansing that's coming. Therefore are they before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. And he that sits on the throne shall dwell among them. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more, neither shall the sun light on them for heat. They'll never suffer again under any condition whatsoever. And here's that same phrase again. For the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them and shall lead them unto the living fountains of water, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. This wiping away of all tears, it's really talked about in the Revelation, the last thing that Christ gave us. It's one of the concluding climaxes that we're looking forward to are the wiping away of tears. So they're very valuable to God in His sight. Very valuable. Revelations 21 at the very end. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle, which is Christ, of God is with men, and He will dwell with them, and they shall be His people, and God Himself shall be with them and be their God. Again, He shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things will pass away. How many times has this affected us? We think about the white robe multitude, the souls under the altar, the tears that have been shed through the centuries. He remembers every one of them. They're in His book, just like David talked about in that book. Those tears are remembered. And they are heard, but they had to go the distance. They had to go the distance and perish, or at least in this life. We can see this is one of the conclusions of the book of Revelation, the very last thing the Lord gave us. We read in Malachi, And they that feared the Lord spake one to another, and the Lord hearkened it and heard it. And a book of remembrance was written. Again, there's that book. It's there, and it's filled with the tears and the memories that God has not forgotten before Him, and them that feared the Lord and that thought on His name. Look who's in the book. Those that think on His name, not those that just carry a title of Christian. They thought on His name. Then it says in the very next verse, and they shall be mine, saith the Lord of hosts, in that day when I make up my jewels. That's the way he sees you. You're His jewels. You're not just numbers. You're not just a census or a long list of names. You are His jewels. And I will spare them as a man spares his own son that serves him. And we know how jewels are made. All of these rocks in this picture, they went through thousands of years of pressure underground. And then when they brought out of the ground, they're chipped away at and polished. So they go through a lot of pressure and a lot of cutting. Our lives are the same also. We go through a lot of pressure and a lot of cutting sometimes. Ecclesiastes tells us, as we wind down here, there is a time to weep and a time to mourn and a time to dance. It's required of us. We wouldn't know life if we didn't weep occasionally. We can't dance every day. It'd be nice, but we can't. You wouldn't learn what you need to learn. And it's like, do not the seasons of our lives teach us this so? We all go through seasons, ups and downs. There are times where we can think of the most horrific things we've experienced or others we've seen. And then there are times where they're on top of the world. So our lives go through seasons because there's a time to weep and a time to dance. So that I look forward to when there's no more weeping and it's just all dancing. And it seems like that's coming. I need to take some lessons. So a couple more verses here as I close. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. When you sow, you got to plow. You got to do things. You sow in tears, you will reap in joy. This is a requirement. He that goes forth and weeps, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. Again, you don't live and you don't learn if you don't weep, and it's required of us. Psalm says, verse 30, very well-known verse, for his anger endures but for a moment. In his favor is life. Weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. We know this doesn't mean just one night and it's all gone in the morning. It means a short period of time. We were going to have to weep. And we're in that short period of time, and so is the world's in that time. But joy will come in the morning. So, if you would, brethren, just imagine the first sunrise of the kingdom age. And Christ is in the earth, and the sun's coming up. What a day. Truly, on that day, joy will come in the morning. It'll be a day unlike any day we've ever seen. Not just for us, but when we're standing with the brethren of the ages and hearing their stories and they hearing ours. Even so, come, Lord Jesus.